Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. If you'd like to listen to this or any previous episodes of the show, please go to our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter @IrishHistoryPod. And if you get a chance, please like and review the show on iTunes. It really helps us, it boosts us as people are looking for the show. Now today we're very, very pleased to be joined by Barry Sheppard. Barry is going to talk about Muintir Tíre and Father John Hayes. He's going to talk about some of the other aspects of Catholic social teaching and Catholic action in this early period of the 20th century. Barry, you're very welcome to the show.
Thanks very much.
We have to thank you as well for having us on your amazing history show on MVTV, History Now. You had us up there before Christmas, much appreciated. And anyone who has a chance, please check it out on Vimeo.
Thanks very much, yeah, it was good to have you, and the people in the studio were very happy with that particular programme. It was great. Thanks very much.
So first I'd like to ask you, what is Muintir Tíre?
So Muintir Tíre, and my northern accent, I've been told by some people I'm not pronouncing it right. Muintir Tíre were, and still are, they're an organisation which in Irish means the people of the land. They began life in the early 1930s, and they were basically a self-help organisation that were based in part on Catholic social teaching. You know, the very famous social encyclicals, Rerum Novarum in 1891, and then Quadragesimo Anno in 1931, which is brought out in the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. So they were very much an organisation driven by Catholic social teaching. That's not all they were driven by. There were a lot of sort of international influences, because John Hayes lived for a time outside of Ireland before he formed Muintir Tíre. And in my current research, I'm researching the origins of them outside of Ireland. I'm also researching the connections that he made with organisations which, like his, were founded on these same principles in countries as far away as Canada, Australia, Vietnam, and there's some action going on in the likes of Greece and Africa and Italy, things like that there. So it was a very international organisation.
What drew you to this topic, Barry?
Well, this goes back to actually the first article I wrote for the Irish Story on the Rathcairn Gaeltacht. So I was very interested in how governments, especially the Fianna Fáil government in the 1930s, used this Rathcairn Gaeltacht supposedly to breathe new life into the Irish language. I've heard that it was also an experiment to take people from uneconomic holdings in the west of Ireland and put them in fertile land and farming land in Meath. So the blueprint that they used for the Rathcairn Gaeltacht, it was small acres of land. I think it was like 22.5 acres, a house, and 22 acres for small farm tillage. And I talked to so many people and they were talking about how this was to do with the Irish language, but I looked at it and it was all, and especially if you look at Fianna Fáil's first, it was like a mini manifesto in 1926. Some of those points were very consistent with the Catholic social teaching that was in Rerum Novarum, and it was about establishing as many people on the land as practicable and things like that. So that was my first inkling when I was writing it, but I was very much writing it in the context of the Irish language. When I was researching that, and I was in the National Archives in Dublin, and I found this nothing more than a memo that was tacked on to another page, a larger page. And I looked and there was this letter for help from an organisation called the Catholic Land Movement of Britain. And it was from a Miss Maddox, who was writing to the Irish government. She was writing to the Land Commission, saying about the Rathcairn thing. She said, if you would be so kind as to send me on any literature you have or a blueprint of this scheme that you're running, because we're very much wanting to implement that in the part of Britain that she was in, the south of England. And I thought this is really strange, this is really interesting, I've never heard of this group before. So I looked into this group, the Catholic Land Movement, and there was a lot of Irish connections in there, including one of the main people who was Father Vincent McNabb, who was believed in this, medieval guild society. But anyway, I was looking at that group, and then I was on looking through Irish newspapers, and I found a speech that was given on behalf of the Catholic Land Movement to Muintir in their rural weekend. They had this rural weekend where the people come to discuss Catholic social teaching and farming issues and really rural issues with like a talking shop. And the person it was Mr. Harold Robbins, and the standout line from that was this: the genius of our common philosophy has led widely scattered groups across the globe in the fight against capitalism and and things like that. I thought this is very sort of communistic here, and then I delved more into it and found all these organisations who were called was a really lazy reporting Catholic communism and things like that there. So this really sparked my interest in how they interpreted the Rathcairn thing the way I had been thinking about it myself, so it gave a bit of validity to that. So then I delved more into that, and then started to look into Muintir, and Muintir made connections with this Catholic Land Movement, very low level things, but still they had common objectives, and they were called the Back to the Land movement, the British one. And I looked at a speech John Hayes gave and said, "We are not a Back to the Land movement, we are a Stay on the Land movement." So I thought there was a very interesting juxtaposition here from a heavily urbanised society in Britain and a different one in Ireland.
So it's how Ireland is part of a wider international kind of movement. But let's take it back to the start and the founder of the movement, John Hayes. Can you tell us about his background?
Yeah, John Hayes is a very interesting character. He was born in 1887, but he was actually born in a land league hut. His parents and older siblings were evicted in April 1882 by their landlord, who was Lord Cloncurry. Valentine Lawless was his name. He had lands in Kildare, but he also inherited land in Limerick, Moreau. Hayes was, like I said, born in a land league hut. His family, a number of siblings were born there and died in this hut. So for 12-13 years they were based in this makeshift house, which had them centred in one of the, a really famous land war battle. So Hayes he played on this heritage of his, this really special heritage that he was born in this hut. His parents were in the land league, and he used this further on in his career, which I can get into. But in terms of his origin story, he was born in a land league hut. He grew up and around the land league in his early life. Him and his brother ended up, he was he was in the IRA in the 1920s, and Hayes actually, he went to a school in Limerick and then went to the Irish College in Paris and became a priest. But he's a really, really interesting character. The family are very interesting, but that is where he began, and that was the catalyst for his later career, in rural development.
How do you think the fact that Hayes is coming from this rural radical background, the land league, evictions, hating your landlord, compared to some of the people in the same sort of milieu of Catholic social teaching? I think it was Father Dennis Fahey. He was talking about the ideal period in Europe was the 12th or 13th century, where before you had the French Revolution and the Protestant Reformation. And it's this very sort of backward-looking, feudalistic, people knew their place. How does the fact that John Hayes is more tapped into this sort of rural radicalism, how does that influence Muintir na Tíre as it grows?
Okay, that's very true, that sort of thing about medieval guild system. And the person I mentioned before, just want to say this before going to Hayes, Vincent McNabb, who was born in Portaferry in County Down, but he was very much, wanted to go back. In one of his speeches, he goes, he wants to take society back, not to Creasy or Agincourt, but he wanted to go even further back. He wanted to go back to Jesus in Nazareth. So he was, that sort of backward thing. You find this, a longing for an idealised past among all these groups to a certain degree. G.K. Chesterton, who was, one of the main sources of inspiration for that Catholic land movement, he said famously, the only step forward is the step back. So his as well, he was very influenced by Chesterton and was really enamoured with this, the medieval guilds. But I think that his grounding, where it's different, is it has to come from this land war. He's very rooted in that, and he's really he lionises people who took part in the land war, especially Michael David. So my own reading of this and what I've looked at him, he does display some of these themes of going back in time, to an idealised time, but he's very rooted in what has happened in Ireland, and he sees what's happened in the 1930s as people on the land in Ireland haven't really moved that much forward. So rather than, he takes elements of that sort of idealised past but roots it in modern Irish history.
What's the relationship between this idea of agrarian reform and Irish nationalism for a man like John Hayes?
Right, okay, this is very interesting because I've been reading Chesterton's Irish Impressions book, which came out in 1919. Now, to give a bit of context to that, Chesterton had this socio-economic theory called distributism, and distributism was all about small farm ownership, decentralised capital, tariffs, and even local tariffs, within countries. This really it gained a lot of traction among Catholic converts in Britain. And when Hayes was in his first, he was in Meath for a while as a trainee priest, but his first proper position was in Liverpool. And his original biographer, Stephen Rinn, talks about the influence G.K. Chesterton's work had on him. And he bought into what Chesterton was saying, but to bring it back to this land reform, this distributism, Chesterton was actually of the mind that, the Wyndham Acts, the Balfour Acts, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, they were distributism writ large, because they allowed tenants to buy their own, holdings. So his argument was that this distributism went sort of hand in hand with Irish nationalism. And I find that very interesting because that's what Hayes was born into.
It's a very mainstream view among Irish nationalists at the time.
Yeah, so he writes in such really eccentric and flowery language that it takes you time to plough in to see what it's very allegorical. But once you get through it, you can see that there's a guy, I'm really sorry, I can't remember the guy's name, but he wrote this really interesting paper about Chesterton called G.K. Chesterton, England's Irish Apologist. But it's very interesting that Chesterton saw the land reform issues that were going on as what he was preaching about distributism. Now, what Muintir and Tíre were about wasn't exactly distributism, but it was along those lines of small land holders and land reform and community development.
Well, I think that could take us into as well, as it will become in the future, the cooperative movement and trying to form productive economic avenues for people living in uneconomic areas.
Absolutely, and when Muintir and Tíre first formed, they formed as a cooperative society. But that only lasted up until 1937, and then started when the structure of the guilds, which some of my dad's own cousins were involved in Tipperary. It's really fascinating. It's about trying to develop a classless society, but the cooperative movement part of Muintir and Tíre, that's something I haven't looked at yet. But I am aware of it. Owen Devereux did a series of papers on Muintir, and especially about around that, you know, the early 30s, which was very interesting. What I have, John Hayes, in his speeches and different papers, he talks about the cooperative movement, the more famous, you know, the Horace Plunkett Cooperative Society. He wasn't a fan of Horace Plunkett simply because he thought that Horace Plunkett was too involved with the landed class to really understand Irish conditions of Irish smallholders.
I mean, when John Hayes was young and in the days of the land war, you know, there was this fairly simple nationalist story to be told, that the land was held by the descendants of Cromwell. You know, Ireland was ruled by England. But by the time Muintir was founded, it was a new context.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
you know, the Irish Free State was founded. So how stood the land question in independent Ireland?
Yeah, that's the really interesting thing about it. Is, but you know, by the time you had, you know, the later land acts in the 1930s, early 1930s, there was a lot of research done, and I know Alwyn Purgey in Queen's has written about it in the northern context. You know, the small landholders, okay, they had, you know, their land, they had this, you know, small piece of land, but they weren't in any way better off than what they were. Their lot hadn't really changed that much. So what is interesting about the cooperative movement, Patrick Doyle has a new book out, and the title of that book is called Civilising Rural Ireland. I found that really interesting in the context of John Hayes. He talks about his mission as being saving rural Ireland. So circumstances, yes, have changed. People are own their own homes to a large degree, and, you know, farms, but it's, you know, they're not living up to their potential, is what way I see what he thought of it.
Well, I think another issue as well we should really talk about, and I presume one that Muintir and Tíre were very interested in addressing, is emigration from rural Ireland. What was their views on emigration?
Well, that's, as I said, you know, they said they were a stay on the land movement. So they wanted to structure rural Ireland in such a way that people had not only jobs, but they had things to do. So the parish hall was a really important thing to do. Part of their, you know, parish plan. And what you had the Muintir and Tíre Film Club. You had, you know, a dramatic society and things like that. So it was very much community development, just to show the potential of your community. Of course, you know the overriding factors they had no control of really took over, and I'm sure, you know, he was, to a certain extent, could have been beating his head against a brick wall, you know, because they hadn't the power to change, you know. Economic factors are out of their control, but, you know, it was very much about community and rural development and showing the positives of what the you know, rural society was.
Well, it's just one more issue as well that I think is interesting, is that a lot of these movements are not calling on the state to do things.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually saying the state should be stepping back.
Yeah.
How does Muintir and Tíre fit into this in terms of the Irish state at the time?
Yeah, the Catholic social teaching element of it, there's definitely this, you know, from the bottom up, you should be looking after themselves. The state should have a minimal role in it. Now that doesn't mean to say that they didn't go to the government for financial help. They did, and a lot of times. But one in the early part of my research and this is coming up to the emergency. Davila told them, if this organisation is to flourish, it has to be on a voluntary basis. So there were appeals to the government now and again. This is something it actually is something I want to look at later on, and focusing more now on the international aspect of it. But there's definitely, you know, I can't tell the full picture without that. It's just that I'm not too sure of the ins and outs of it, what they received and what they didn't at the minute, but they definitely made appeals to government for funding. But it was definitely all about sort of self-help and, you know, working from a parish level up rather than relying on too much top down.
Did Muintir operate on a 32 county basis or just in the Free State?
No, this is the thing that's very interesting, is that they tried to start something up in the north. In 1942, John Hayes travels to Belfast and addresses an assembled crowd in St Mary's Teacher Training College. The contemporary newspaper reports tell of, like a whole spectrum of people, regardless of a religion or political persuasion, were all there, and they all greeted him so well, sort of well received. And after that, then the Young Farmers Clubs of Ulster, a few months later, came down to the Rural Week in 1942. But in UIG, in the Hardyman library, they have the Muintir collection, and there's a file on Northern Ireland, and it's so thin. It just doesn't seem to have gotten round to it. There are people who are appealing for them to come up, but it doesn't seem to have gotten off the ground.
And what year was Muintir actually formally founded?
They had the first meeting in 1931, so 1932. They sort of really come into existence as cooperative. But that in the context of the time, in 1931 you had Quadragesa Milano, 1932 of course you had the Eucharistic Congress, and with the Eucharistic Congress you had this like explosion of Catholic action and Catholic groups who were inspired by various papal social teachings. So Muintir sometimes, lumped along with that, movement, but Hayes was very careful to disassociate himself with that, in a way, being in it, but not being in it.
Why was that?
I'm just speculating here. It's because, I think, personally, it's because of it being rural-based, where a lot of these organisations were, like the Legion of Mary and stuff, they're very associated with Dublin. So, but I think because of Muintir's mission to save rural Ireland, plus the background where you saw them very much as a successor to the Land League, I think in those ways they were different from them.
And just one more question about the immediate context then. So 1931 to 32 is a quite tumultuous time politically in the Free State. It's the change of power between Civil War rivals of Fianna Fáil taking power for the first time by electoral means. How did party politics interplay with Muintir?
Well, Muintir very much as they could be apolitical, and they basically extended invitations to whoever was in government. So right throughout you see, you've got Costello, coming, you've got De Valera coming, the Rural Weeks, you've got anyone who's in power coming to this. It's, in some way it's like the Plan Championships today, like people go there basically to win votes. So that's why I think, the different politicians are all going there.
And what was the relationship with other religious groups? Is this like a Catholic organisation for Catholic people in rural Ireland?
No, absolutely not. John Hayes was at pains to stress that they were a Christian organisation. I'll give you an example. In the 1942 Rural Week that I was saying, and the Young Farmers Clubs of Ulster came to Rural Week, and in his summing up in the Rural Week record, he stresses that these groups from different backgrounds came together and lived together in the spirit of Christian harmony. So, and I've heard that some clergy members or other organisations criticised Hayes for saying that they were a Christian organisation rather than a Catholic organisation. Of course, they're the demographics state that most of them are Catholic, but there was one of the senior Muintir people, Tony Varley, has written a chapter on him in the book Ida Milnes and book on Southern Protestants. And there's I just can't think of the guy's name at the minute, but he's in there, and he was a Protestant member of Muintir, so it definitely wasn't just. And I think that validates his point where he's talking about that they were different, they were separate from the main Catholic action organisations.
In terms of an ideal Ireland, what would the vision of John Hayes and Muintir have been? Would it have been, something like the idealised notion of Eamon de Valera of rural Ireland?
Kind of, there's a similarity there, especially in De Valera's 1943 St. Patrick's Day address. He talks about, happy maidens and things like that there. Now, it's definitely not as, quotable as that, what John Hayes says, but, he says about the Ireland of our dreams is the Ireland of the past. I've read, he said that, I think that was in one of his obituaries.
And what does that mean? Like, is there serious economic thinking behind that, or is it?
It's hard to. He was sort of very romantic. What I see in him, he's like a romantic nationalist, and that's very interesting because he picks out figures from Ireland's history, and I think he does it in an emotive way. To generate people's emotions. He references Padre Pierce quite a lot, and it's I'll give you an example. In I think it was the 1940s, there was the Pioneers gathering, and it was in Croke Park, and Hayes addressed that, and who he name checks in that speech, very close together is Archbishop Croke, Archbishop Mannix of Melbourne, Padraig and Willie Pierce. So he's the
cultural nationalists rather than land people.
Yeah, so there is that real element of romantic cultural nationalism. I haven't done enough on the economic side of it yet, but they do seem to be clued in, because they had people like John Bustede, who was a professor of finance UCC, who wrote about the world economic crisis in Rerum Novarum. So they have Catholic economic thinkers who come to speak at Rural Week. So it's not completely, just plucking things out of the air. There are solid theories, no matter what. If you knock those theories or not, they do have theories.
I mean, I've talked to some historians, far more than me, about social and economic history of the era, and they say one of the problems is politically it makes sense to divvy out the land into small plots, which is what a lot of small farmers want, but economically that makes no sense, because they're not economically viable. So how does Muintir deal with that kind of contradiction, if at all?
Yeah, that for me, that's hard to say. In terms of, I can only tell you in terms of, the Catholic social teaching that's around that. The Rerum Novarum, I'm not going to be able to quote verbatim, but they talk about, how a small plot of land is a man's wages only in another form. So this small piece of land is the blueprint from a Catholic social teaching point of view. In terms of how it's plays out economically, if it's economically viable, that's a whole different question that so far I haven't read anything from them that actually addresses that. I'm sure ideally they would have wanted a nation of small farmers, and if you look at when the Irish press comes along, there's a lot especially in the first few months, there's a lot of articles in that about what the encyclicals teach us about small landowning and things like that there. So it's very much riding on this political crest that Fianna Fáil brings into the political arena with them when they first come in, and in the 1930s. So there's a lot of they complement each other what they want, but ultimately I don't think, so far from what I've read, I don't think they had a solid plan on what this should be.
And did you notice any sort of anti-urban feeling in the writing, that the cities are places where girls are corrupted and where the housing is unhealthy and all this type of stuff, you see? Oh,
absolutely. And again, Owen Devereux has written on Muintir and their anti-urbanism. Very much a part of their ethos. And that also goes back to cultural nationalism as well. So there are similarities, and you can see why certain people would be attracted to that, and in terms of the moral issues of it as well.
So is this the idea that the towns are remnants of British rule and the true Ireland is in the countryside? This kind of idea?
Well, yeah. Hayes actually says that rural Ireland is the real Ireland. But what is really interesting, it's they talk about they're a parochial organisation, and when people are talking about them being parochial, it's almost like thinking that they're small-minded, but they're not. They go beyond the parish, And Hayes himself travels internationally and makes all these connections with organisations across the globe. So, the parish is the base, but, in terms of what they want to achieve, I think, pretty much they had really solid ambitions outside of the nation.
Now, this very interesting point you were making there, Barry, about the international connections. What do you think John Hayes took from looking at other movements in different countries and brought back to Muintir na Tíre?
Okay, so that international exposure starts before he started Muintir na Tíre. As I said, when he was in Liverpool, he was very interested by Chesterton's views on distributism. I have to clarify here that Stephen Wren, his biographer, talks about how he was really taken with the Distributist League, which wasn't the case because the Distributist League wasn't founded until 1926, and by then Hayes was back home. But distributism was being debated around. So he had this, idea of distributism, which Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc popularised. Really a sort of a side point that Wren makes is that Hayes was so taken with G.K. Chesterton that he started to dress like him and had one of these sword sticks that Chesterton walked about in. But that's by the by. I just find that very interesting. He's influenced, in a sort of style as well as socioeconomic theory. But when he was in France, there was an organisation, rural French organisation, and I know I'm going to say this wrong, but it's a Semaine Sociale. So it was like a social organisation in the countryside that came together and spoke about rural issues and stuff. So that's very much what he was doing with the Rural Week. So he had that influence there. In terms of other influences, European influences, you had the Belgian Boerenbond, which was one of these rural development organisations in Belgium. So he had these ideas that he was bringing into Muintir na Tíre to start with. But if you go back even further, which I think is really, really interesting, is that as far back as when he was 13, he displays this knowledge of international events. When he was in the school in Limerick, he wrote a poem on a critique of Clive's reforms in India. So even from the age of 13, he's displaying an awareness of things that are international affairs. So he's always internationally minded, and in his French diaries, he was Wren calls him a notorious rule breaker in the Irish College in Paris. So they weren't allowed to go too far from the Irish College in Paris. He went into the French countryside, and he was walking through a farm in rural France and found this plough that was made in Wexford. So he found out enough about it to come back and give a lecture on Irish farm machinery in France. So he had all these ideas of borrowing from different places to get this thing off the ground.
You mentioned Vietnam.
Yeah, there's a priest. There were two priests from Vietnam, and one was a Father Phong, and this was in the 1950s. Now Hayes died in 1957, so this was the early to mid 1950s. These Vietnamese priests came over to the Rural Week and were very interested in how this blueprint of community development all would be a defence against communism. So you had that there, and you had people in Africa contacting him, trying to get help with doing something similar. Now it wasn't South Africa, but it may have been Nigeria, Greece as well. We had all these requests from across the globe to help implement these things. So he did have a really, really strong international reputation.
When you hear all the names that you're mentioning there, like Hilaire Belloc and Chesterton, you sort of assume that this movement must be deeply, deeply reactionary and deferential. Is that a fair criticism, or are people on the wrong end of the stick?
With Chesterton and the likes of Block and those Catholic land movement people, no. You know, they're very reactionary. Hayes is a complicated character. He's very progressive in some ways, but he's a product of his time. He's born in 1887. How progressive can you be? In terms of how we would see it, but he isn't a one-dimensional character who's, sometimes we used to, thinking of priests as, in such a way. He's very surprising in a number of ways, how, especially his love of revolutionary movements in Ireland, which I think is really, really interesting. He's very, taken with the United Irishmen. He's also very taken with Fenianism. And there's in Enemente, I think is the papal encyclical. I'm probably pronounced that wrong as well, but that's the papal encyclical which is warning against oath-bound organisations. So Hayes obviously knows the stuff when it comes to papal encyclicals. How does he, square that circle where he's, a really, really massive fan of the Fenians, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and of the United Irishmen, secret oath-bound organisations. He's really enamoured with Fenian, writing and Fenian poetry and things like that there. And, Charles J. Kickham's Knock na Gá. That's the really interesting thing about that is that we were talking earlier about growing up with books in the house and stuff like that there. His father had this really Puritan view of reading, that it was taken away from your work time. And the only book that they had at home was Knock na Gá, Kickham's Knock na Gá.
Which was the idealised vision of a rural...
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So that book is a massive influence on him, especially when it comes to the publications. Muintir Tíre release in the 1940s, The Landmark, which was their newspaper. Hayes writes under the pen name of Phil Leahy, who is a character in Knock na Gá, and the section that he writes in the newspaper is called Knock na Gá Corner. Later on, in rural weeks, where they had dramatic societies, they put on plays of Knock na Gá and things like that. So he is really, it is revolutionary Fenianism he's interested, but it's also the cultural, product of Fenianism.
Well, I suppose as well as we're talking about like rural weeks and getting interesting speakers and discussing all these ideas, there's also the element of dances and maybe meet a spouse at these type of things. Like, how important was the social aspect to members of Muintir na Tíre?
Yeah, it really was a cornerstone of them, and I was actually, I was speaking with Katrina Clear earlier today, and she was talking about women who joined Muintir na Tíre in the 50s and 60s when working conditions allowed that. So she was telling me that there was a lot of single females and married females came into it too. They also had close associations with the women's movement. Now I don't know what went on at these things, how many romances came of it, but there's a very interesting thing that I was reading about John Hayes, and this goes back to what you would think about priests as these people who are never the man and woman should meet. Especially in like that film Jimmy's Hall, where you have the priest is taking names of the boys and girls who are there. This thing that I was reading about Hayes during the week said that he wasn't like that. He didn't concern himself with boys and girls, men and women meeting at dances. He was much more focused on what could they do together, like to promote the countryside. So yeah, it's he doesn't neatly fall into that sort of thing.
When was the peak, Barry, of Muintir na Tíre's influence, and how did it start to decline in influence?
I think the peak is with John Hayes. Hayes dies in 1957, January 1957. In terms of, it's really hard because my study is so focused on Hayes and his influence. But when you go into the 1960s, they become involved in, aspects of community development within the European community. So in terms of their influence, they are attaching themselves to government bodies on a European level. Before Hayes died, he was the chair of an international Catholic refugee committee. So when it was leading up to his death, especially when you get to the mid-50s onwards, all these international connections come really thick and fast, and it's a really fascinating period. And it really gets you. Well, I suppose he was 70, when he died. So that's a good long life when you're talking about dying in the mid to late 50s. But what could have happened if he'd have stayed on? Because it just seemed to me that he was really just getting going in the late 1950s. There was a really slow development of Muintir in terms of the international, outreach and making connections. That really sort of takes off in the 1950s, and then he dies in January 1957.
Well, is there, maybe I'm being unkind here, is there a bit of a one-man band about it? Can it survive its passing?
No. There's really a strong supporting cast, if that's the right term. It's just that they're not the people that I've been looking at so far. So far, I've looked at his family background, and all the sort of, the things that he's been doing. He does have a really, really good network of people around him, especially Tom Fitzgerald, who was his secretary, and Tom Fitzgerald's still alive. Tom Fitzgerald, I think, is in his 90s now, and he was the custodian of all the Muintir papers, John Hayes' personal papers, which is now in NUIG, and it's, if anybody's interested, that's a really good place to go. Barry Houlihan there and Geraldine Curtin are, they've been really fantastic in helping me, pull these things out. My research is at a relatively early level, but I've been looking at, aspects of Muintir and their, international outreach for a couple of years now.
So, Barry, what do you think Muintir at the peak of its influence in the 30s, 40s and 50s tells us about the Ireland of that time?
Right. It tells us that there were people who living in rural Ireland who were emigrating, who couldn't eke out a comfortable or a fulfilling life on the land. Hayes, very much rooted in the community, rooted in rural Ireland, saw himself as and his organisation as I've said, a reincarnation of the Land League, who wanted to reinvigorate the whole community, right? What his memories of the land was everybody coming together. So he wanted to replicate that. Their influence, obviously, what they did by the 1950s or something, they had late 40s, early 1950s, they had over 400 guilds across Ireland. And that's, you have probably about, say, 10 people per guild. If you have 10 people per guild, you have 400 guilds, you have 4,000 active members. That's a big organisation, a big voluntary organisation. Of course, some of these guilds were morning glories. Some of them, faded away very quickly. But Hayes was really on the ball in terms of structure. You look in the records that he has about the guilds. What were they doing? How active were they? What can we do to get them reactivated and stuff like that? So he was very much involved in a lot of, planning for the whole, where they were primarily in and around Tipperary, Munster. Some of them were up in Cavan, things like that there. So some of them were spaced out. But he was very much hands-on, seeing what they could do to get, if a group fell away, what can we do to get them back? So they were very, influential in that way. But also going back to what he saw their organisation as a bridge to the past. A bridge to the past. He very much talks about all these people who were born and died before the Civil War and before, bitterness and splits and things like that. So that's why you hear him talking about Pierce, David, people like that, who weren't tainted by, the Civil War or anything like that there. So it was very much of a, trying to bind society together.
And in terms of the Ireland of today, is there any future for this this vision of an idealised rural Ireland, do you think?
It's a really interesting question, and you do, especially we're in a society that has a lot of immigrants coming into it, and you see these people who have a strong online presence who harp on about the Ireland of the past without really knowing what it was about. I'm talking about reactionary people who perhaps demonise migrants. So that vision of an idealised Ireland is very abstract. It's not something that was rooted in the knowledge that Hayes and the people who founded Muintir had. So in terms of, is there a place for that Ireland of the past? It's not being recalled or anything in any really positive way, the way that they tried to do it as a stay on the land, we'll revitalise rural Ireland, things like that. I think the Ireland of the past is being used as a really negative, concept at the minute. But I have to say that Muintir still in existence, but they've very much changed over the years from what they began with. But they're still there. So perhaps somewhere down the line they'll change again.
Well, that was brilliant. Thank you very much, Barry. That was Barry Sheppard talking about Muintir Tíre and Father John Hayes. If you'd like to listen to this episode or any previous episodes of the show, please go to our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can catch us on Twitter at Irish History Pod, or you can visit our Facebook page too, The Irish History Show. My name is Carl Brennan, and as always, I'm here with my co-presenter John Dorney. Now, if you'd like to check out Barry Sheppard's show, it's on MVTV. It's also up on Vimeo, History Now, and there's also a lot of Barry's previous articles are up on the Irish Story website. So on behalf of myself and John, thank you very much for joining us.